Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ryan Starks, and I'm the Life Sciences Practice Leader at Centri. Joining me is Charlie Higgins, Managing Director and one of our leaders in the Life Sciences practice. Today, we'd like to talk to you about contingent value rights, or CVRs, in life sciences transactions, and more specifically, how to value them. First, however, we'll define CVRs, talk about when and why they're most encountered, provide some typical structures in life science transactions, and wrap up with the various ways CVRs can be valued. So, Charlie, what exactly are contingent value rights?
Well, quite simply, Ryan, CVRs are a form of public company contingent purchase consideration that's dependent upon some future event or events occurring. If the event occurs, usually by a specified date, the CVR holder receives a predefined payout, usually cash, but sometimes shares. If the event fails to occur, no additional payment is made.
Thanks, Charlie. That seems simple enough, but why would a transaction include CVRs?
Well, technically speaking, any transaction could include CVRs for any reason. Where they're most common, however, is in transactions where the buyer and seller have significantly different perceptions of the value of the seller's company due to the company's prospects. While these value gaps are present in most acquisitions across all industries, the inherently risky nature of life sciences companies, particularly early stage ones, often results in very significant value gaps. CVRs can be used to help bridge that gap to get a deal closed. Looked at another way, CVRs allow buyers to de-risk a portion of the purchase consideration and therefore unlock additional value for the seller.
So now that we know what CVRs are and when and why we're likely to run across them in a transaction, how common are they in life science transactions? And can you discuss some typical structures and the valuation methodologies that are generally used?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me share my screen. I have some data on that. So, according to an article from September of last year, published by the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, CVRs have increased in popularity over the past decade, increasing from about 10% of announced deals in 2013 to 2017 to nearly 30% of announced deals in 2022 and 2023. When you look at smaller deals, which we'll define as $500 million or less, the use of CVRs increases to nearly 45%. The most common structures we see in life sciences transactions include payments made upon the achievement of developmental and regulatory milestones and financial milestones, and occasionally stock price milestones. The type and mix of milestones typically vary depending on where the company is in its life cycle. If the target's preclinical, I would expect to see milestones based on developmental and regulatory metrics. For example, additional payments would be made when the company enrolls a specified number of participants in phase 1 clinical trials, has a successful phase 1 result, begins phase 2, etc. Payments for these types of milestones tend to be fixed amounts, and there's reliable success rate data available. So a probability weighted or scenario-based methodology would likely be used to estimate fair value. For example, if a $2 million payment is due upon achieving the milestone, and the data suggests that there's a 10% probability of success, the fair value of that payment will simply be the present value of $200,000, 10% of the $2 million. Now, that's an obvious oversimplification, but you kind of get the idea with that type of milestone. When a company's further along in its life cycle, and there's reasonable visibility to commercialization, though, the structure tends to get a bit more complicated, mixing developmental and regulatory milestones with the financial milestones. If a company in the middle of phase 2, for instance, were to be acquired, I would expect to see milestones associated with completing phase 2, then getting final regulatory approval, and hitting one or more revenue targets or maybe if units, maybe units sold if pricing is a bit fuzzy. In a structure like that, you're likely to see multiple valuation methodologies used. The developmental milestones are no different than in the prior example, so we'd see a scenario-based method. When we get into the revenue-based payments, though, exactly how those payments are structured will determine the most appropriate valuation methodology for those milestones. If we look at a relatively simple structure where the CVR holder will receive a lump sum payment if a specified revenue target is achieved, a closed form option model, known as a digital call option model, will generally be appropriate. Even seemingly more complicated structures can lend themselves to fairly simple models as well, though. Take, for example, a structure where the holder receives a fixed percentage of revenue over a specified period. Because the payout is a linear function of the underlying metric, meaning that the amount of the payout falls on a straight line that mirrors the metric, fair value can be reasonably estimated by a scenario-based model or simple option pricing model. Either model will provide the same answer if properly applied. Even common nonlinear payouts can often be valued with relatively simple closed-form option pricing models or a combination of a few of them. I would offer a little word of caution here, though. Applying a bunch of relatively simple models at the same time can often turn out to be more complicated and harder to explain than a single, more complex model that captures all those outcomes in a single model. To that end, not every structure can or should be valued using simple models. When the amount of the payment or payments depends on how or when you get from point A to point B, what we refer to in valuation as path dependency, more flexible models like Monte Carlo simulation are generally required. A fairly common example is when the structure allows for catch-up payments for previously missed milestones. For example, if the company misses year one's revenue milestone, but beats year two by so much that the aggregate revenue over that 2-year period is greater than the two milestones combined, the holder could potentially receive the year one payment as well, although a year later. Another common example is when there's a cap on the aggregate payments. For example, you might have 3 milestone payments that could be $2 million each, but the total payment is capped at $5 million. So for example, you meet those first 2 milestones in totality and get, the 2 million for each or 4 million, even though the last on its own is worth 2 million, potentially, you're only going to get an extra million in that case. There's really no way to capture situations like that in a closed form model or a reasonable combination of models. So revenues and the resultant payments would generally need to be simulated. Regardless of the methodology, though, it's vital that the valuation properly addresses the risk of achieving each milestone and the risk associated with the company actually being able to make the associated payment. If we go back to the first example of a preclinical company that will make their additional payments after achieving developmental milestones, there could be a considerable risk that the company won't actually be able to make those payments if they're supposed to be in cash, because they're spending their cash on their development process. The valuation needs to address that. There's significant risks associated with that. To be clear, though, the risk of non-payment is always present, regardless of stage of development, and does need to be accounted for. But that's a very obvious example.
Wow, a lot to digest there, Charlie, and thank you for keeping things in relatively simple terms.
Well, you're right. There is a lot to digest, and I did leave out most of the technical details to not bore everybody to death. But that's why valuing CVRs, or really any form of contingent consideration, is not something that should be taken lightly or left to people who lack the appropriate experience and expertise. Whether the structure is relatively simple or even ridiculously complex, CVRs often account for a significant portion of the total consideration in life sciences transactions, particularly for early stage companies. So applying the right methodologies and applying them correctly is critical to properly accounting for not only the CVR, but also the overall transaction.
Thanks, Charlie. Very informative, and I think you provided some great insight.